Well, I was talking about radiocarbon dating in the last class very badly. I know I did it badly. Well, I did do it badly, but sometimes teachers give bad classes. Okay. All right. Oh, go on. Everybody looks sad and shed a tear for me. But anyway, I wanted to get some idea of radiocarbon dating and its importance in archaeology. And this is especially so with this particular site, the site at Çatalhöyük, which some people like to call the first town. Well, we'll look into that to a certain extent. But really what we have to start off with to understand Çatalhöyük is general concepts of development with mankind. And one of the most important stages in the development of mankind really was this period or phase that we call the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution is the name we give to a stage in human history when man first began to domesticate wild plants and wild animals. It didn't happen all at once, it happened in different parts of the world at different times. We use this general term Neolithic Revolution wherever it happened, but it's not a specific period. The thing about the Neolithic Revolution is it changed human lifestyle. Up to this point, what you have are family groups, extended family groups, hunter-gatherers, people moving from one place to another, perhaps living in a cave during the winter, but generally following animals, hunting animals, collecting wild plants as their food resource. So you've got these small little social groups around the whole of the world, the Middle East and Europe. But then we see the Neolithic Revolution. People realize that they can domesticate plants. You can improve the plants. Well, these days we worry about genetic modeling or whatever it is, you know, changing plants that way. But it's the same sort of thing in a sense in that period, crossbreeding plants and animals to improve the plants and so forth. But if you're going to start having the field, and if you're going to start having groups of animals that you look after, you tend to get a larger group of people being involved. So instead of there just being little groups of hunter-gatherers, family groups walking about, we see people starting to come together. They start to live in villages, permanent villages, houses made of mud brick. Well, ever since the beginning of the 20th century, it's basically been believed that the Neolithic Revolution in terms of the Middle East and Europe starts off in what we know as the Fertile Crescent, stretching from modern Jordan through Israel, the occupied West Bank, Syria, in between the two rivers, Euphrates, Tigris and Mesopotamia, a little spread over into this southeastern part of Turkey as well. The reason for believing that it starts here are quite simply that this is the natural home for the oldest examples of wheat, barley, the legumes, beans, mercimac, all that type of thing. This is the area where those plants grow naturally. This is also the area where the four most common food animals originated: cows, sheep, goat and pig. So it's obvious that Fertile Crescent had to be basically where the Neolithic Revolution started off. In the 1930s in particular, when people start going through the Fertile Crescent, identifying it as the home of the first domesticated crops and animals and so forth, lots of excavations were done in what was then the British occupied territory of Palestine. Palestine seemed to be where the Neolithic Revolution began. This was based on the evidence of excavations at Jericho, where people found what seemed to be the earliest permanent settlement known of in the Middle East. At the bottom levels of Jericho, the excavators found that there was no pottery. The earliest peoples of the Neolithic Revolution stored their food in animal skins and baskets made of straw. It was only later on in the Neolithic period that pottery is introduced. Now, I'm telling you this because you've got to be familiar with these terms: pre-pottery Neolithic period, PPN, and the pottery Neolithic period, the PN. Well, having identified where the Neolithic revolution seemed to have started, people wanted to find out, how did it spread? How does it spread into the rest of the Middle East? How does it spread into Egypt? How does it spread in Europe? Well, the question of how it spread into Europe was a particularly interesting one, because the earliest Neolithic settlements in Europe, known of then and still today, belong to what we call the pottery Neolithic period. Well, that was the situation in 1949. The one thing that nobody knew, of course, was when did all this happen? The radiocarbon dating brings this all into focus. Before the development of radiocarbon dating, it was thought that Jericho was no earlier than about 4000 BC, pottery Neolithic period about 3000 BC. Carbon-14 dating pushed it back first to 6000 BC, then 8000 BC. Well, this was really adding thousands of years onto human history. Then the big surprise came when people started to look at Neolithic sites in Europe. These all belong to the pottery Neolithic period, and they date to 5000 BC, the earliest one. Well, obviously, the Neolithic revolution, the idea had to spread into Europe via Anatolia, what is now the Republic of Turkey. So there had to be lots of sites somewhere in Anatolia that belonged to this general period, the pre-pottery Neolithic period going down into the pottery Neolithic period. 1957 is when the search for these began. This man here, James Mellart, an English archaeologist, but his family had migrated from Holland in the 18th century, so he's got this Dutch name, and his wife Arletta is Turkish. He was the director of the British Institute of Archaeology in Ankara. That's what he looked like in 1957, and still going strong today in London. He decided that the best place to look for evidence for the spread of the Neolithic into Anatolia and then into Europe would be around the Konya Plain. Why the Konya Plain? Well, the Konya Plain is absolutely full of these hoyuks. A hoyuk, remember, is a settlement mound. You have mud brick buildings built on top of each other. After about 50 or 80 years, a mud brick building would be demolished, another one built on top, and bit by bit the whole mound goes up. The Konya Plain is full of hoyukla like this. So Mellart started to walk around and look at these, hoping that he would find a settlement mound with early pottery, Neolithic pottery on the top, because that would indicate that the settlement mound must have started to grow in the pre-pottery Neolithic. He's hoping he can find a good site. It wasn't until 1958 that, searching all the way around the Konya Plain, he eventually arrived at a site called Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük, roughly about, I think, 50, 60 kilometers to the southeast of Konya itself. This is the photograph he took when he was making his way to Çatalhöyük. And you can begin to see why it's Çatalhöyük, fork Hoyuk, because it's actually two separate settlement mounds, not one. Here we have the Google view. There's the big mound, Çatalhöyük East and Çatalhöyük West. And you can see there's a road going in between them. The road forks, so this is why it's Çatalhöyük. He made his way up onto the West Mound first of all. It was relatively small. It was only about 10 meters high, not too big. All the pottery on the top was Bronze Age date, after the Neolithic. So he went up to the top of Çatalhöyük East Mound instead. Çatalhöyük East Mound is 20 meters high, 13.5 hectare in area. And when he got onto the top of this and he started looking in this area over there, what did he find? But pottery of the early pottery Neolithic period. Imagine the excitement. He's on a 20-metre high hoyuk. The earliest types of Neolithic pottery are found on the top. He knows he's got 20 metres at least of earlier Neolithic occupation. Well, Millard then had to get a permit and he started work there in 1961. On the very first day, he transformed our knowledge of the Neolithic period completely. There are not very many photographs, unfortunately, surviving from the early excavation, but this is one of them here, and they dug a lot faster in the 1960s than they do now. But what Millard found on the very, very first day was basically the remains of mud brick buildings that were all built to the same basic plan, all of them with walls surviving at least 1 metre high. The evidence indicated that periodically the houses have been deserted, deliberately demolished and filled in with ruined mud brick, everything levelled off, and then another house built on top of that. He could see that the houses usually just had 2 rooms, 1 big room and 1 small room used for storage by the side. The really fascinating thing in many ways was that in this one small area he's working, he finds he's got something like 40 houses, all built right next to each other. There are no streets. The access had to be through the roof. It's a standard arrangement which you could see until quite recently in parts of Syria. I mean, people don't trust their neighbours. So, you get a ladder to go up onto the roof. That's how you get into your house. But essentially, there are no streets. All these houses were built close together like that. This is the plan of what Mellart excavated at the very top of the Çatalhöyük mound, the latest pottery Neolithic period, which is still very early. He could see from the types of pottery this had to date to somewhere about 6000 BC. And here we've got a reconstruction of what it probably looked like. Then, as he made his way down, he found he had, what you would expect, another layer of settlement buildings. And everything indicated that each of these houses had been occupied for roughly a generation, possibly 50 or 60 or even 80 years. And then the houses had been demolished, the mud brick piled in, and a new house built on top of the site. Well, this was an absolutely major find. If you look at what had been found in Jericho, there was nothing like this. I mean, just this one small area of the site, less than 1/10 of the site, absolutely jam-packed with houses of the pottery Neolithic period. That's a pretty amazing discovery. What was even more amazing, on the 3rd day of the excavation, he started to find houses with painted walls. Well, nobody, of course, really suspected that any idea, people might have lived in houses with decoration on the walls until the Roman period. But these are pottery Neolithic houses with painted walls. In fact, most of the houses that Mellart excavated had some form of decoration on the walls. Sometimes it was just simply a scratched geometric design like this, just scratched into the side of into the wall. In other cases, they were painted geometric decorations using a red pigment from a red clay, painted on a white background like this. It's just a pretty attractive pattern, well, a honeycomb pattern, if you like that type of thing there. But some of them were even more exceptional. For example, one of them seems to show what Mellart interpreted as a hunt scene, in which you've got this enormous bull or reindeer figure. It's not quite certain which. It's more likely to be a reindeer. And you can see people hunting it, one of them with his head lost there. Well, it's natural to think that paintings like this might actually sort of symbolize something. Here's a photograph of Mellart actually working on that hunt scene painting. You can just see the deer down there again in the 1960s. The paintings all belong to the pottery and Neolithic period. There could be absolutely no doubt about that. So it's the earliest examples of art that we have after the cave paintings of the Paleolithic period. Some of the paintings were really very intriguing. They seem to be paintings of textiles. Now, if you look at this one here, you've all got a kilim at home, or your parents have got a kilim, your grandparents have got a kilim. Now, this is the kilim design. It's as if these paintings are actually based, in some cases, on carpets, kilims, or textiles, or something like that. Multicoloured. Well, multicoloured. Red, white, black. Not so much like that. But some paintings or scratchings really couldn't be properly interpreted, and they're still a subject to debate. For example, one house was covered with paintings showing what seemed to be vultures, large birds, possibly eating dead bodies. Well, in some societies, it still is common practice, in parts of India, for example, parts of Tibet. The ground is very rocky. The religious beliefs don't encourage burying of the dead, allowing the body to rot. So what happens when a person dies is the body is cut up into pieces and placed in a sacred field to allow the birds to come and eat the bodies. Happened today. Well, fair enough. This might represent a similar type of ritual. Remember that archaeological word, ritual, when we don't know what's going on, but something's going on in an organised fashion? Well, this might be the same sort of thing happening at Çatalhöyük. Notice all the bodies are headless. Rather interesting thing. There were several paintings of bulls, in addition to the deer hunt painting. Again, a lot of argument as to what these actually represent. Well, that's very definitely a bull, but is this a painting of people chasing a bull, hunting a bull, or is this people worshipping a bull? We really don't quite know. Mellart didn't know what on earth he'd actually found either. There were a few paintings of human figures, which seemed to be wearing clothing or loincloths, like leopard skins like this. Well, it might come as a bit of a shock to you, but until the Roman period, leopards were quite common in what is now Turkey. The Romans used to get their leopards for hunting in the games in Rome from Anatolia. And there's still wild cats in some parts of Turkey today. But this presumably is some kind of status scene. What Mellart thought was the most remarkable painting, though, was this one, which he interpreted as the town view. This is a photograph of it during the excavation, and you can see it's just on the side of a wall, surviving just over 1 metre high. That's as you see it today in the Anatolian Civilizations Museum here in Ankara. This is what the original scene was like. Well, when Mellart found this, he was immediately struck by the fact that what you had was a series of rectangular shapes backing up against each other, and that sort of figure, symbol, which he thought probably represented Hasandar, not too far from Aksaray. And he thought also possibly Hasandar, volcanic eruption. Well, that interpretation is not accepted today, but for a long time it was believed that this was the first ever plan of a town or a city. That explanation is not so popular today as it was in Mellart's time. Mellart decided, when he started to write up his excavations, that basically what he had was a whole series, was a community. And remember, this is pottery Neolithic date, not pre-pottery Neolithic date. A community in which some people were living in what were clearly houses decorated with elaborate paintings, but he did find a number of houses or buildings which had bull's horns in them, real bull's horns built onto plaster or mud or clay imitations of bull's heads. Some evidence in some buildings of what might be a seated god figure. It's very difficult to know exactly what it is. So he began to visualize a society in which you don't really have a town as such, but you've got people living next to shrines or sanctuaries, demolishing their houses, their shrines, their sanctuaries, their cult rooms every 50 to 80 years or something like that, and then rebuilding them. The paintings of the bulls, platforms with bulls' heads and bulls' horns on them like this convinced him that this was a place of mixed function. It's not just a settlement, but everybody's got their own little sacred spot next to their house as well. This is a restored view of what one of these bulls-headed rooms would have looked like. You can see the clay platform for people to sit on, the bull's horns on one side like this. In the background, of course, a reproduction of that famous bull hunt painting there. What surprised him when he started to look at the platforms was that some of them had burials in them. Most cases, it was just a normal inhumation burial. The body had been placed there, the platform had been built up. And this indicated another rather surprising feature about life at Çatalhöyük. People are living there. Somebody in the family dies, they bury them in the house, and they build a platform over them so they can sit on top of dead granny or dead grandma or whoever it is, like, "You all right down there?" "Yes, I'm okay, thank you very much." And as if they sort of wanted to keep on living with their ancestors. Although, in a few cases, what Mellett found were headless burials. Now, you can actually indicate whether or not a person's head has been chopped off while they're alive or at a later date. The only problem is, of course, if it was done immediately after death, you wouldn't be able to spot the evidence. But the evidence seemed to indicate, you see, all the bones are correctly in position, that in some cases, after a person had died, their head had been carefully cut off to be kept somewhere else. Remember, some of the paintings show headless figures as well. And in fact, what Mellett also found was under some of the platforms, human skulls. You can just see the outline of the eyes there, and the remains of what had been a face, a plaster face that had been built over that skull. So there's a kind of head worship aspect to the whole site as well. These were very remarkable finds, but what was even more remarkable in many ways was the particular soil conditions that, at Çatalhöyük meant that an awful lot of things were preserved you wouldn't normally find on an excavation. Textiles, clothing from the pre-pottery and Neolithic period. Of course, the usual type of everyday artifacts like this. This is an obsidian spearhead. It's very similar to the types of thing being used in Jericho at the same particular time. Most remarkable thing, several examples of this. It's a piece of obsidian, and you can see the size of it, which had been polished. Obsidian is a natural volcanic glass, and it's been so finely polished, it was used as a mirror. It fits beautifully in the hand. There were several examples of this. Well, you know, we've got this evidence anyway from the Paleolithic period that people took a pride in their appearance. They would wear necklaces. Well, now we know that in the Neolithic period, the people were walking around saying, how do I look today? How's my hair? Pretty good, yeah, like that. I mean, there are just amazing insights into how people were living there. Also, the first hints of people getting the idea of communicating through symbols and writing. Not writing as such, but there are several examples of these seals, some of them quite elaborate like that, individual seals for marking things. This belongs to me. Boom, I've made a mark. A few of them purely geometric like that. So, I mean, all sorts of amazing things coming out from the excavations at Çatalhöyük 61 onwards. There was also some evidence that suggested to Mellart that the society might have had a belief in a mother goddess type figure. He found several examples, sometimes of stone, figures like this, really quite small. This one actually made of clay, it's about that high. The head has been restored, but they all fit into a general pattern. You've got a female figure with very large buttocks like that, usually large breasts. It suggested that this is a woman giving birth from that figure underneath there. What is fascinating about this particular one is that when we get into the Greek and the Roman period, and Cybele and Aphrodite and all those goddesses from Anatolia, we always find them with leopards or lionesses on either side. So you can see why Mellart thought this might be some evidence for a mother goddess cult of some kind. He started to build up a picture of Çatalhöyük as he understood it. The Çatalhöyük pottery Neolithic period was a kind of mixed society in which you would have people, one family houses like this, usually divided into two rooms, a series of platforms, sometimes with dead bodies buried underneath them. But in between the houses there would be what he identified as, well, this is the French slide, as you can see, sanctuaries, cult rooms. These were rooms with bull's horns in them, more elaborate wall paintings, that sort of thing. So this was the idea he was building up. Well, he still hasn't, by 1963, even worked out what date the site is. He knows that he's got this pottery and Neolithic material from the top of a 20-metre high Höyük. And so what he decided to do in 1964 was to basically dig a big hole right through the side of the mound to get to the bottom and take samples for radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating, remember, it was developed in 1948 and 1949, started being introduced in 1950. It would take a year to date one sample. It was incredibly expensive, but Mellart realized that this would be the only way he could get some idea of the date of Çatalhöyük. He's got pottery Neolithic on the top, 20 metres or more of pre-pottery Neolithic below. What date is it? Well, he dug a trench right down as far as he could. He dug the trench to 4 metres below the present ground level. 24 metres of houses, one on top of the other. He had approximately 12 or 14 separate periods of occupation on the site. He took his radiocarbon samples and sent them off to London to be dated. 1 year later, they came back. The oldest date at Çatalhöyük was 11,250 BC. Jericho, which was long thought to be the oldest permanently occupied settlement, doesn't go back any earlier than 8,000. The youngest radiocarbon date he got at Çatalhöyük was 7,650 BC. This created an enormous storm. I mean, apart from the fact he's discovered these wonderful paintings, these strange sanctuary rooms, the burials in some houses, all sorts of weird and wonderful things, he's pushed the Neolithic revolution right back to by another 3,000 years. Well, it's also creating a problem. The evidence is indicating from Çatalhöyük the Neolithic revolution didn't start in the Middle East, in the Levant, in what was Palestine, Jericho. It actually starts in Turkey. Oh, that's a bit of a big surprise. Many scholars really decided, no, this can't possibly be right. Carbon-14 dating, it's too new a development, it's not quite right, we really got to, we can't trust these results or anything like that. So Mellart decided to carry on with the excavations in 1965, but then was expelled from Turkey. What had happened was in Konya, people started, in the antique shops, Mother Goddess figures started to be sold, seals, things that clearly came from Çatalhöyük. And so a court case was brought up against Mellart. He was accused of selling antiquities. This goes back to an earlier incident in his career in Turkey. The real reason he was actually expelled from Turkey was that he had very strong left-wing views. And if you know your history of the Turkish Republic, you will know that in the 1960s, it was not very popular to go around saying you are a socialist or a left-winger or a communist or something like that. So Mellart was kicked out of the country and the mystery of Çatalhöyük developed. As the years went by, more and more sites began to be excavated in Mesopotamia and in the Levant, giving dates for the pre-pottery Neolithic that were older than Jericho, that seemed to tie up with what Mellart was getting in Çatalhöyük, but not as early as Çatalhöyük. Then a site not far from Aksaray, Aşıklıhöyük, was excavated. And the radiocarbon dates from the bottom of that site were actually older than Çatalhöyük. So the mystery of Çatalhöyük developed. It was finally agreed in 1993 that a new excavation could start off there in Çatalhöyük to try and resolve the mystery of this site. It really is one of the most important sites in the world. Well, this is where Mellart was digging, a very small area with incredible results. The new excavations are taking place on the top there. And these are being done in a very carefully controlled way. These new excavations are beginning to reveal some things that tie up with what Mellart suggested and other things that don't. This is the planar part of the new excavations. You can see again on the top of the mound, a long way away from where Mellart was working, the same basic types of building that Mellart had been excavating. Here's one of the new buildings under excavation. You can see the mud brick walls preserved up to a height of 1.5 meters in this particular case. Some traces of paintings, but you can also see the bull's horns in the corner of this particular house here. This is the same house a bit further down. What the new excavations are revealing is that basically what is happening at Çatalhöyük in the latest occupation level, 7,500 BC, so roughly the same time as Jericho, on top of a 20-meter high Höyük, is that you do have these houses which are occupied perhaps by one generation of a family, possibly two. Then they're deliberately demolished. Sometimes people are buried within the houses while the house is being used. Sometimes you have multiple burials, as if lots of bodies have been brought together and put in one particular place at one time. But then the house is demolished. We still don't really know the reasons why. It may be that people periodically would move, every generation or so, to a new settlement site. The new excavations are confirming again what Mellart said, that bodies were buried beneath the seating areas in these houses while the houses were being used. In some cases, you've got a large number of bodies placed in one particular pit. The new excavations have also focused on this idea of there being cult rooms and a mother goddess figure. Well, these are some of the new mother goddess figures. This one's really very small, that one's a bit bigger. An analysis was done of where these were found. And to begin with, it was established that the so-called mother goddess figures are actually not really that common. There are many more figures of animals and things like that. But more interestingly, these are usually found in rubbish pits, broken. Well, you could argue that the idol, the figure of the mother goddess, has become broken, so therefore it's no longer powerful, so they've buried it. But normally what you would find in most societies that have been studied in terms of their religion is that an old religious artifact is still treated with respect. And so people are now beginning to actually think that these are not mother goddess figures, they're toys. Which makes sense. Kids always have toys. Well, these new excavations are continuing on and on and on. 1995 is when the new period started. They are still continuing. Much slower basis than was ever done by Mellart. More and more we're getting evidence for how people actually lived there. We can see that some of the houses were deserted in the winter months. Soil analysis. We can get a better idea slowly of how long each of these houses were being lived in. So now the excavations all take place, very high tech, under this wonderful shelter like this, which survives the winds and the Conyers Plain. And if you make your way to Conyers, do go to Chatelhauer to go and have a look at the excavation sites and see what there is there. The excavations at Chatelhauer have examined less than 5% of the pottery Neolithic phases at the site. We still don't know quite how the Neolithic revolution happened, how it arrived in Anatolia, where it actually started. What has been discovered, though, is because of the early dates of Chatelhauer, is more and more work has been done on looking for the origins of the wild plants that were first cultivated. And strangely enough, the oldest types of wheat that we now know of grow naturally not in the Fertile Crescent, but in Turkey. So the evidence beginning to point to the southeast of Turkey being where the Neolithic revolution began. Very important stage in our development. We wouldn't have universities and cities without the Neolithic revolution. Is Chatelhauer a town? Well, there's nothing to indicate it's a town in the sense we might think of a town or a city. All the houses are exactly the same size, give or take a few centimetres. They've all got basically the same plan. There's slight differences in the quality of decoration, but not really a lot. Material culture is basically the same. Pottery Neolithic is the same type of pottery throughout the whole area there. We would expect a town, and remember the size of Chatelhauer, 13.5 hectares. If it was a town, you'd expect to have some main political focus or a religious focus or some building that belonged to a social hierarchy. It doesn't seem to exist here. It's rather like, in a sense, Mohenjo-Daro, where you have this enormous settlement with no clear evidence for how the whole settlement was run. Well, Chatelhauer then, not the world's first town perhaps, but certainly the oldest and largest settlement of its type. One of the earliest places where we can look at how people came together and decided to live together as a group, to share their resources, to share their abilities, and to have something you can call home. Okay, there we are. I'll do another early finish, I think, on that one. Yeah, probably. Specific period. The thing about the Neolithic revolution is it changed human lifestyle. Up to this point, what you have are family groups, extended family groups, hunter-gatherers, people moving from one place to another, perhaps living in a cave during the winter, but generally following animals, hunting animals, collecting wild plants as their food resource. So you've got these small little social groups around the whole of the world, the Middle East and Europe. But then we see the Neolithic revolution. People realize that they can domesticate plants. You can improve the plants. Well, these days we worry Well, I was talking about radiocarbon dating in the last class very badly. I know I did it badly. Well, I did do it badly, but sometimes teachers give bad classes. Okay. Oh, God, everybody looked sad and shed a tear for me. But anyway, I wanted to get some idea of radiocarbon dating and its importance in archaeology. And this is especially so with this particular site, the site at Çatalhöyük, which some people like to call the first town. Well, we'll look into that to a certain extent. But really what we have to start off with to understand Çatalhöyük is general concepts of development with mankind. And one of the most important stages in the development of mankind really was this period or phase that we call the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution is the name we give to a stage in human history when man first began to domesticate wild plants and wild animals. It didn't happen all at once, it happened in different parts of the world at different times. We use this general term Neolithic Revolution wherever it happened, but it's not about genetic modelling or whatever it is, you know, changing plants that way. But it's the same sort of thing in a sense in that period, crossbreeding plants and animals to improve the plants and so forth. But if you're going to start having the fields and if you're going to start having groups of animals that you look after, you tend to get a larger group of people being involved. So instead of there just being little groups of hunter-gatherers, family groups walking about, we see people starting to come together. They start to live in villages, permanent villages, houses made of mud brick. Well, ever since the beginning of the 20th century, it's basically been believed that the Neolithic Revolution in terms of the Middle East and Europe starts off in what we know as the Fertile Crescent, stretching from modern Jordan through Israel, the occupied West Bank, Syria, in between the two rivers, Euphrates, Tigris and Mesopotamia, a little spread over into this southeastern part of Turkey as well. The reason for believing that it starts here are quite simply that this is the natural home for the oldest examples of wheat, barley, the legumes, beans, merjimak, all that type of thing. This is